Maybe you know what it feels like to walk past the ruins of something that once held everything you loved, to see the decay of a place that was supposed to be your forever, to carry the weight of memories in a heart that never got to say goodbye. This is a story about a young woman who inherited more than just bricks and broken windows. She inherited the silence of unanswered questions, the echo of laughter that stopped too soon, and the chance to rebuild not just a house, but the life that was taken from her before she was old enough to understand what loss really meant. Her name was Emma Carter, and she was 24 years old when the letter arrived from a law firm she had never heard of, informing her that she was the sole heir to a property located at 1847 Riverside Lane, a house that had been sitting abandoned for nearly 2 decades. Emma had spent her entire childhood in foster care, shuffled between 7 different homes, never knowing who her real parents were or why she had been left at a fire station wrapped in a yellow blanket, with nothing but a silver locket around her neck. The social workers told her the same thing every time she asked about her family, that there were no records, no relatives, no one who had come looking for her. And eventually she stopped asking because the silence hurt more than the not knowing. She had built a life for herself through sheer determination and an almost stubborn refusal to let her circumstances define her future. Emma had worked 2 jobs to put herself through community college, then transferred to a state university where she studied architecture, spending countless nights in the studio drafting buildings she would never see constructed, dreaming of spaces that could make people feel safe and seen and at home in ways she never had been. Her professors noticed her gift immediately, the way she could transform the most mundane requirements into structures that seemed to breathe with life and purpose, how she understood instinctively that architecture was not just about walls and roofs, but about creating shelter for the human heart. After graduation, she took a position at a small firm in the city, working on residential projects that paid the bills but never quite filled the empty space inside her where a sense of belonging should have been. The letter came on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, delivered to her tiny studio apartment that barely had room for a bed and a desk, and when she read the words informing her that she owned a house, that she had inherited property from parents whose names were listed as Michael and Sarah Carter, she felt something crack open inside her chest that had been sealed shut for as long as she could remember. The address meant nothing to her at first, just numbers and a street name in a town she had never visited. But when she looked it up online, she found herself staring at a property listing from 12 years ago that had never sold, showing a 2-story craftsman house with a wide front porch and dormers that looked out over what must have once been a beautiful garden. If you are listening to this story from somewhere far away or somewhere close to home, if you are hearing these words in a moment when you need to believe that broken things can be made whole again, please take a second to leave a comment telling me where you are right now, what brought you here, and if this story is speaking to something in your own heart. The photographs in the listing were old, and the house looked tired even then. But Emma could see past the peeling paint and the overgrown yard to the bones of something that had been built with care and intention, the kind of place where people had meant to raise a family and watch their children grow and sit together on summer evenings counting fireflies. She called the law firm the next morning and spoke to an attorney named Mr. Henderson, who explained that the property had been held in a trust since her parents died in a car accident when she was 6 months old, that the house had been left exactly as it was the day they died, locked up and waiting, and that the trust had specified she could only inherit it when she turned 24 or finished her education, whichever came first. Emma asked why no one had told her any of this before, why she had spent her whole life thinking she had been abandoned, when the truth was her parents had died and left her everything they had. And Mr. Henderson said quietly that there had been complications with the foster care system, miscommunications, lost paperwork, the kinds of bureaucratic failures that happen when a child falls through the cracks and no one bothers to look closely enough to see her falling. He told her the house was hers now, free and clear, and that she could do whatever she wanted with it, sell it or rent it or let it continue to sit empty. But Emma already knew what she was going to do even before she hung up the phone. She drove out to Riverside Lane the following weekend, a 4-hour journey through changing leaves and small towns that seemed frozen in time, her heart pounding harder with every mile that brought her closer to the place her parents had lived and died. the home they had prepared for her before they ran out of time to see her grow into it. The house stood at the end of a quiet street, lined with oak trees, set back from the road with a gravel driveway that was so overgrown with weeds it was barely visible, and when Emma pulled up in front of it and turned off the engine, she sat there for a long time just looking at the place that should have been hers from the beginning. The craftsman structure was still solid despite the years of neglect, with its characteristic low-pitched roof and wide eaves, exposed rafters under the eaves, and a front porch that wrapped around one side with tapered columns sitting on stone pedestals. The paint had faded to a dull grey blue and was peeling in long strips. The shutters hung crooked, several windows were cracked, and the garden that had once been carefully tended was now a tangle of wild roses and blackberry bushes fighting for space with waist-high grass. Emma walked slowly up the broken brick path to the front door, her hands shaking as she fitted the old key that Mr. Henderson had given her into the lock, and when the door swung open with a groan of rusty hinges, she stepped into a time capsule of the life she was supposed to have had. The inside of the house was dim and smelled of dust and old wood and something else she could not quite name, perhaps the particular scent of time passing in a space where no one has breathed or laughed or cried for 20 years. The furniture was still there, covered in sheets that had once been white, but were now grey with accumulated dust, and as Emma moved from room to room pulling back curtains to let in the afternoon light, she began to see the pieces of her parents' lives preserved in the exact positions they had left them. In the living room there was a blue velvet sofa facing a brick fireplace, built-in bookshelves filled with volumes on architecture and gardening and poetry, a record player with a stack of albums beside it, and photographs on the mantel showing a young couple who looked impossibly happy, her mother with long dark hair and her father with kind eyes and a gentle smile, both of them beaming at the camera in various stages of their life together. The kitchen still had dishes in the drying rack, a calendar on the wall frozen on September 1999, and a high chair pushed into the corner that Emma realized with a jolt must have been meant for her. Upstairs, she found 3 bedrooms, and when she opened the door to the smallest one at the end of the hall, she felt her breath catch in her throat because it was a nursery, painted in soft yellow with white clouds on the ceiling, a crib with a mobile of stars and moons still hanging above it, a rocking chair by the window, and a bookshelf full of children's books that had never been read to the child they were meant for. On the changing table was a stack of folded baby clothes, impossibly tiny, and on the wall was a framed print that said, "Welcome home, Emma," in careful calligraphy. And she understood then that her parents had been ready for her, had prepared this space with love and hope and all the dreams parents have for their children, and that everything had been stolen from all of them in a single moment of bad timing and bad luck. She sat down in the rocking chair and let herself cry for the first time since she was a child, not the silent tears she had learned to shed in foster homes where showing emotion was a weakness, but deep wrenching sobs that came from a place so far down inside her she had not known it existed. She cried for the parents she never got to know, for the childhood she never got to have, for all the years she spent thinking she was unwanted, when the truth was she had been desperately wanted and then lost, and she cried for the young couple in the photographs downstairs who had built this house and filled it with love, and never got to see their daughter take her first steps in these rooms. When she was finally empty of tears, she stood up and looked around the nursery with an architect's eye, seeing past the dust and the water stains on the ceiling and the way the wallpaper had started to peel in one corner, seeing instead what this space could become with work and time and the kind of careful attention her parents had given it 24 years ago. Emma made a decision then that would change everything. Standing in that abandoned nursery, with the afternoon light slanting through the dirty windows and the smell of her parents' love still somehow present in the walls around her, she would not sell this house or let it continue to decay. She would restore it, bring it back to life, make it the home it was always meant to be, and in doing so she would honor the parents she never knew and reclaim the life that should have been hers from the beginning. She spent that night in the house, rolling out a sleeping bag on the living room floor, and she lay awake listening to the old structure settle and creak around her, getting to know its sounds and rhythms the way you would get to know a person. And somewhere in the dark hours before dawn, she felt a sense of peace settle over her that she had not felt since she was 6 months old and safe in her parents' arms. The next morning, she called her boss and gave her notice, explaining that she had a family emergency and needed to take an indefinite leave, which was not exactly true, but felt true enough, given that her entire understanding of her family and her history had been rewritten in the span of 48 hours. She packed up her studio apartment, which did not take long, since she had learned long ago not to accumulate too many possessions, when you never knew where you might end up next. And within a week she had moved into the house on Riverside Lane, with a plan and a purpose, and a determination that surprised even her. The restoration began slowly, because Emma insisted on doing as much of the work as possible herself, partly to save money, but mostly because she needed to put her own hands on every surface to learn this house from the inside out, to make it hers through labor and sweat and the kind of intimate knowledge that only comes from stripping something down to its bones and building it back up again. She started with the roof because the water damage was extensive and would only get worse with the winter rains, hiring a contractor to replace the damaged shingles and repair the flashing, then moving inside to address the plaster that had cracked and fallen, the floors that needed refinishing, the windows that needed repairing or replacing. She worked 12 and 14-hour days, learning skills on YouTube and through trial and error, teaching herself how to sand and stain, how to patch and paint, how to restore old woodwork and make broken things work again. The house began to reveal its secrets as she worked, and Emma found traces of her parents everywhere, notes her mother had tucked into books, sketches her father had drawn on the backs of envelopes, a shoebox in the attic filled with letters they had written to each other before they were married, full of the kind of hope and tenderness that made Emma ache with the injustice of how little time they had been given together. In the basement, she discovered her father's workshop, still organized with meticulous care, his tools hanging on the wall in careful rows, and a workbench with an unfinished project that appeared to be a wooden toy chest with her name carved into the lid. She finished it herself, learning to use his tools, following what she imagined his hands had been doing 24 years ago, and when it was done she placed it in the nursery and filled it with blankets and soft things, making it useful again after all these years of waiting. As the months passed and fall turned to winter and then to spring, the house slowly transformed under Emma's hands from a shrine to a tragedy into a living space that honored the past while making room for the future. She painted the exterior a soft sage green with cream trim, restored the porch and added hanging plants and a swing, repaired the garden and planted roses and lavender and all the things she found mentioned in her mother's gardening journal. Inside, she kept the furniture her parents had chosen, reupholstering pieces that were worn, refinishing wood that had dulled, but adding her own touches too, a reading nook by the living room window, open shelving in the kitchen displaying the dishes her mother had used, her own books mixed in with theirs on the built-in shelves. She transformed the nursery into a study where she could work on her architectural drawings, keeping the yellow walls and the welcome home sign, but replacing the crib with a drafting table and filling the space with light and possibility. The house became known in the neighborhood, the old Carter place that had sat empty for so long suddenly coming back to life. And Emma met the neighbors who remembered her parents, elderly couples who told her stories about the young family who had lived there briefly, about how her father had helped fix everyone's problems and her mother had organized a community garden, about how excited they had been about their baby girl and how devastating it was when they died, and the house was locked up with no explanation and no one ever came to claim it or care for it or explain what had happened to the child. Emma learned that she looked like her mother but had her father's eyes, that her love of building things had come honestly because her father had been a carpenter before he went back to school to become a teacher, that her mother had been a landscape designer who believed gardens could heal people, and that together they had been planning to turn their home into a kind of community center where neighbors could gather and children could play and everyone could feel like they belonged to something larger than themselves. The more Emma learned about Michael and Sarah Carter, the more she felt she was not just restoring their house, but completing their interrupted work, creating the home they had envisioned, the place of safety and beauty and connection they had wanted to build. She began inviting the neighbors over for coffee, hosting dinners on the restored porch, starting a community garden in the side yard, the way her mother had planned. and slowly the house filled with life again, not the life it had been meant to have, but a different life. One that Emma was creating herself, while honoring the foundation her parents had laid. People told her she had a gift for making spaces feel welcoming and alive, and Emma realized this was the real architecture she had been meant to practice, not the commercial buildings she had been drawing in the city, but the creation of home in the deepest sense, the kind of place where people felt seen and valued and safe to become whoever they were meant to be. One afternoon in late spring, almost a year after she had first walked through the door of the abandoned house, Emma was working in the garden when a social worker showed up looking for her, a middle-aged woman named Patricia, who had been going through old files and had discovered the error that had been made 24 years ago, the paperwork that had been misfiled, the failure to connect Emma with her inheritance and her history. Patricia apologized profusely, explaining that she had only recently been assigned to review closed cases and had found Emma's file and realized the magnitude of what had been missed, and she wanted to make amends somehow, though she knew nothing could give Emma back the years she had lost. Emma invited her in and made tea and showed her around the house, explaining what she had done and what she was still planning to do, and Patricia looked around with tears in her eyes and said this was exactly the kind of outcome they always hoped for in her line of work, but almost never got to see, a child who had been lost finding her way home despite everything that had gone wrong. She told Emma that her parents had left not just the house, but a substantial savings account that had been sitting untouched all these years, growing with interest, and that Emma was entitled to all of it, enough money to finish the restoration properly and maybe even start the community center her parents had dreamed of. Emma thanked her for the information, but said the money was secondary to what she had already found, which was the sense of belonging she had been missing her whole life, the knowledge that she had come from people who had loved her and wanted her and prepared a place for her, and that she was not abandoned, but rather the inheritor of something precious and worth preserving. The house on Riverside Lane became more than just Emma's home. It became a kind of symbol in the small town, proof that broken things could be mended. That time did not have to mean the end of possibility, that a person could take the fragments of a shattered past and build something whole and beautiful from them. Emma continued her work as an architect, but shifted her focus to residential design with an emphasis on creating spaces that fostered community and connection, and she often brought clients to her own home to show them what she meant, how a structure could hold memory and hope in equal measure, how attention to detail and respect for history could create environments where people thrived. She would walk them through each room, telling the story of what she had found and what she had restored, explaining how the craftsman details her father had loved, the built-in cabinets and the exposed beams and the careful joinery, had guided her own understanding of what it meant to build something meant to last. She showed them her mother's garden journals and how she had used them to recreate the landscape, mixing heirloom varieties with native plants, creating spaces for butterflies and birds, and the kind of wild beauty that her mother had believed could heal the soul. Clients often left in tears, not because of the house itself, but because of what it represented. The possibility that even the most broken beginnings could lead somewhere beautiful, that loss did not have to be the end of the story, but could be transformed into something meaningful and good. During the second winter in the house, Emma discovered something that changed everything again, though by then she had learned that transformation was not a single event, but a process that continued to unfold in unexpected ways. She had been working on restoring the attic, which had been too overwhelming to tackle in the first year, but which she now felt ready to face, and hidden behind a panel in the eaves, she found a wooden box that had somehow escaped her earlier searches. Inside were dozens of letters, tied with ribbon, addressed to Emma but never sent, written by her parents during the months before she was born and the brief months after, chronicling their hopes and dreams and fears for her future. She sat on the dusty attic floor and read them one by one. Her father's letters full of promises about teaching her to build things with her hands and taking her camping and showing her how to see the extraordinary in ordinary moments. Her mother's letters full of wishes for her daughter's happiness and confidence and the kind of fierce love that would make her brave enough to become whoever she was meant to be. They had written about the kind of mother and father they hoped to be, about wanting to create a home where Emma would always feel safe and valued, and free to make mistakes, about how they already loved her more than they had known it was possible to love another person. And as Emma read these intimate declarations from people she would never know, she felt the full weight of what had been stolen from all of them. Not just her childhood, but their parenthood. Not just her memories, but their chance to create them with her. But she also felt something else, a profound gratitude that they had left these words for her to find, that she could know them now in a way that transcended the accident that had taken them, that their love had been documented and preserved, and was waiting all along for the moment when she would be ready to receive it. She spent weeks reading and rereading the letters, memorizing their voices and their hopes, and she began to understand that her whole life had been shaped by the foundation they had laid in those brief months, that the resilience and determination that had carried her through foster care and college and into a career she loved had come from them, inherited not through genes or upbringing, but through the love they had poured into preparing for her, the kind of love that persists beyond death and time and finds its way to the people who need it most. She framed some of the letters and hung them on the walls of the study, daily reminders of where she came from and who she was meant to honor, and she kept the rest in the wooden box on her desk, taking them out sometimes when she needed courage or comfort, finding strength in words written by people who had loved her before she was even born, and who had given her everything they had to give in the short time they were granted. The discovery of the letters also inspired Emma to start a new project, something she had been thinking about since Patricia, the social worker, had mentioned the savings account her parents had left. She began planning to turn the detached garage at the back of the property into a studio apartment, a place where young people aging out of foster care could live rent-free while they got on their feet, went to school, learned a trade, or just figured out who they wanted to become. She knew from her own experience how terrifying it was to turn 18 and suddenly be expected to function as an adult, with no family support, no safety net, no one to call when things went wrong. And she wanted to offer the kind of stability and encouragement she had desperately needed at that age. She hired contractors to help with the heavy work, but did much of the finish work herself, creating a small but complete living space with a bedroom and bathroom and kitchenette, decorating it with the same care she had given to the main house, making it feel welcoming and safe rather than institutional or temporary. She called it the Carter Studio, in honor of her parents and their dream of creating community. And she worked with local social services to find young people who needed exactly what she was offering, a place to belong while they built their futures. The first resident was a 19-year-old named Marcus, who had aged out of the system 6 months earlier and had been sleeping on friends' couches ever since, trying to hold down a job at a grocery store while taking community college classes at night. He was quiet and wary when he first arrived, clearly expecting some kind of catch or condition, not quite believing that someone would offer him a home for nothing in return, and Emma recognized in his careful distance the same protective shell she had worn for years. She gave him space but made it clear he was welcome in the main house whenever he wanted company, and slowly over the weeks and months he began to relax, to accept that this was real, that he could stay as long as he needed, that Emma was not going to pull the rug out from under him the way so many adults in his life had done before. He started joining her for dinner sometimes, helping with projects around the house, and one evening he told her that this was the first place since he was 7 years old where he felt like he could breathe, where he did not have to constantly scan for danger or prepare for the next disruption, and Emma understood exactly what he meant because she had felt the same way the first night she spent in her parents' house. Marcus was followed by others over the years, young women fleeing bad situations, kids with addiction issues they were trying to overcome, teenagers with talents and dreams but no resources to pursue them, and Emma welcomed them all with the same unconditional acceptance and practical support. Some stayed for a few months, some for a few years, but all of them left changed by the experience of being given space to heal and grow without judgment or pressure. And many of them stayed in touch long after they moved on, returning for holidays and bringing their own families to meet the woman who had given them a chance when no one else would. The Carter Studio became known in the social work community as a model program, and Emma was often asked to speak about her approach or to help others replicate it in their own communities. but she always emphasized that what made it work was not the building or the program structure, but the simple act of seeing people and believing in their capacity to build good lives if given half a chance. She said that was what her parents had done for her, believed in her future enough to prepare for it, even though they would not be there to see it, and that she was simply passing that gift forward to young people who needed someone to believe in them the same way. As the years passed and Emma moved through her 30s, the house continued to evolve with her, becoming not just a restored piece of history, but a living space that held layers of meaning and memory. She added a library in what had been the formal dining room, lining the walls with books and creating reading nooks where people could curl up and lose themselves in other worlds. And she hosted a weekly book club that drew people from all over the county, creating the kind of intellectual community her parents had valued. She converted part of the basement into a woodworking shop where she taught classes on basic carpentry and furniture restoration, passing on the skills she had learned from her father's tools and from the necessity of rebuilding her inheritance with her own hands. The garden became a seasonal spectacle, carefully tended according to her mother's original plans, but adapted and expanded over the years. With a meditation circle under the oak trees, raised beds for vegetables that she donated to the local food bank, and a cutting garden that supplied flowers for the whole neighborhood. Every corner of the property reflected Emma's particular gift for creating spaces that invited people to slow down and pay attention and connect with themselves and each other, and visitors often commented that there was something special about the place, an atmosphere of peace and possibility that was hard to define but impossible to miss. Emma found love too, though it came in an unexpected form and at an unexpected time when she was 36, and had long since made peace with the possibility that she might spend her life alone. She met Daniel at a city planning meeting where she was presenting a proposal for affordable housing design, and he was the civil engineer assigned to evaluate the project's feasibility, and they spent 3 hours after the meeting arguing passionately about load-bearing structures and sustainable materials, and the social responsibility of people who design the built environment. He was kind and brilliant, and shared her conviction that buildings should serve people rather than profits, and when he asked if he could see the house she had told him about, the one she had restored as a love letter to parents she never knew, she found herself saying yes before she had time to be nervous about inviting someone into the most intimate space of her life. Daniel drove out to Riverside Lane the following weekend, and Emma watched his face as he walked through the rooms, seeing them through his engineer's eyes but also through the deeper lens of someone who understood what it meant to pour your heart into a structure and make it whole. He asked thoughtful questions about every detail, admired her craftsmanship, read some of the letters her parents had written, and when he finally spoke, it was to say that he had never seen a more beautiful example of architecture used for healing, of how physical space could hold and transform emotional pain into something generative and good. They fell in love slowly, over months of long conversations and shared projects, and the gradual recognition that they were building towards something neither of them had quite believed possible. And when Daniel asked Emma to marry him, he did so standing in the garden under the oak trees where her mother had planned to hang a swing for her daughter, offering her not a ring, but a hand-drawn blueprint of an addition to the house, a sunroom where they could sit together and watch the seasons change and dream about the future. Emma said yes, because she had learned by then that home was not just a place, but a practice. Not just walls and a roof, but the daily choice to show up for the people you love and create space for them to flourish. And she knew Daniel understood that in the marrow of his bones. They were married in the garden on a warm June evening, with the whole community present, Marcus giving Emma away, and Patricia the social worker reading a blessing, and neighbors bringing food and music, and the kind of joy that comes from witnessing two people commit to building a life together. Emma wore her mother's locket and carried flowers from the garden Sarah Carter had designed, and when she and Daniel made their vows to each other, she felt her parents' presence not as sadness or loss, but as foundation, the bedrock on which she was building everything that came next. She never married or had children of her own, though not for lack of opportunity or desire, but she filled her life and her home with people who needed the kind of acceptance and welcome she had once needed. Foster children who came for weekends and stayed for months, elderly neighbors who treated her like the granddaughter they never had, young families who borrowed her garden for birthday parties, and her porch for summer evenings. She found family not in blood, but in the community she built around herself, the way her parents had intended. And she understood finally that the house was not just a place she had inherited, but a gift she was meant to share, a refuge she was meant to offer to others who were looking for home. On the anniversary of the day she first walked through the door, Emma held a celebration, inviting everyone who had helped her along the way, the contractors and the neighbors, and Patricia the social worker, and even Mr. Henderson the lawyer who had first told her about her inheritance. She gave a short speech on the porch, talking about what the house had taught her, about resilience and memory and the ways love persists even through tragedy and time, about how the most important architecture is not the buildings we design but the lives we build and the spaces we create for human flourishing. She said she had spent most of her life feeling rootless and alone, drifting between temporary places that were never quite home. But that standing here in the house her parents built, surrounded by the community they had dreamed of creating, she finally understood what it meant to belong somewhere, to have a foundation solid enough to build a life on, to be not just an architect of buildings, but of connection and meaning and hope. The guests raised their glasses in a toast to Michael and Sarah Carter, whose brief lives had created ripples that were still spreading outward, touching people they would never meet, making the world a little more beautiful and a little more kind. And Emma felt her parents' presence in that moment, not as ghosts, but as the foundation beneath her feet, the walls around her, the roof over her head, the very structure of who she had become. Later that night, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet again, Emma sat in her father's old rocking chair by the window, in what had been the nursery and what was now her study, looking out over the garden where fireflies were beginning to light up the dusk, and she thought about the strange paths life takes, the way loss and longing can be transformed into purpose, the way a person can spend years looking for home only to discover it was waiting all along, patient and faithful, holding space for the moment when they would be ready to claim it. She opened the silver locket she still wore around her neck, the one that had been with her since the fire station, and inside found a tiny photograph she had never known was there, tucked so carefully into the mechanism that she had missed it for 24 years, a picture of her mother holding an infant, both of them looking at the camera with expressions of pure joy, and on the back in faded ink were the words, "You are so loved, always and forever, Mom and Dad." Emma held the locket to her heart and whispered thank you to the parents she had never known, but who had given her everything, who had built her a home and filled it with love and left her a legacy far more valuable than property or money, the legacy of knowing she had been wanted and cherished and that she carried their love forward in everything she created. Daniel came to stand beside her, placing his hand on her shoulder in the easy comfort of people who have learned each other's silences, and together they looked out at the house and land that had become the center of their shared life. She thought about all the young people who had lived in the Carter studio and gone on to build lives of meaning and purpose, about Marcus, who was now a social worker himself, helping other foster kids navigate the system, about the book club members who gathered every week, about the neighbors who had become family, and the way the whole street had rallied when someone needed help or when celebration was called for. This was the community her parents had dreamed of creating, the web of connection and care that transforms a collection of houses into a neighborhood, and a neighborhood into something that feels like home in the deepest sense. The restoration had taken years and countless hours of labor, but it had given her something no amount of wealth or success could have provided, a sense of rootedness and purpose and belonging that came from knowing where she came from and what she was meant to do with that knowledge. She had learned that inheritance was not just about property, but about taking what you are given, whether it is love or loss or some complicated mixture of both, and transforming it into something that serves not just yourself, but the wider world. Her parents had given her a house and a history and proof that she had been loved, and she had taken those gifts and multiplied them exponentially, creating spaces and systems and relationships that would outlive her the same way her parents' love had outlived them. Emma thought about the young woman she had been when she first walked through this door, heartbroken and desperate to understand why she had been robbed of the family she deserved, and she felt deep compassion for that younger self who had not yet learned that the story was more complicated and more beautiful than simple abandonment. The pain had not disappeared, but had been transformed into purpose. The empty places had filled with people and meaning beyond anything she could have imagined, and the house her parents built had become not a monument to loss, but a thriving space of healing and growth for herself and countless others. The house stood solid around her, no longer abandoned, no longer waiting, but alive again with purpose and meaning. A testament to the enduring power of family and home, and the resilient human heart that insists on building beautiful things, even from the ruins of unimaginable loss. Emma had spent her childhood without roots, drifting from place to place with no sense of where she belonged, but she had found her way home eventually, not to the life her parents had planned, but to a life that honored their memory and their dreams in ways they could never have anticipated. She had learned that home is not given to us fully formed, but must be built piece by piece, restored with patient hands and faithful presence, maintained through the daily choice to show up and do the work of making space beautiful and meaningful and welcoming to others. As the last light faded from the sky and the fireflies multiplied in the gathering darkness, Emma reached for Daniel's hand, and together they walked downstairs to the kitchen where they made tea and sat at the table her parents had chosen, talking about their plans for the next phase of the house, the sunroom that would create a bright place for winter mornings, the possibility of starting a scholarship fund for foster kids, the ordinary miracle of having someone to plan a future with, and a place solid enough to build that future on. When they finally went to bed in the room that had once been her parents' and was now theirs, Emma felt the peace that comes from knowing you are exactly where you are meant to be, doing exactly what you were meant to do, loving and being loved in ways that heal not just your own wounds, but the wounds of a broken world in whatever small ways are given to you to heal it. The house on Riverside Lane had been abandoned for 20 years, but it had waited faithfully for the moment when the child it was built for would become a woman strong enough to claim her inheritance and transform it into something beyond what anyone had imagined. Proof that love is the most durable building material, and that the structures we build with it can shelter not just ourselves, but generations we will never meet.